Thanks so much for joining us this morning to discuss maximizing generosity through donor discipleship. When you received your invitation to this webinar, there might have been a question that immediately crossed your mind. Why is a financial advisor providing donor development training? The answer to that question goes back to a client experience I had in the early 2000s that profoundly impacted both my appreciation for the work that you all do, but also my understanding of how the development practices of a faith-based organization can impact both positively and negatively your donor's level of generosity to your particular ministry. The experience that I had is I was working with a donor family, clients that were very, very generous, and they had identified a new ministry that they had never supported before that really captured their attention. And as they started to research, they fell in love with this ministry. They loved the mission and the vision. They loved the fruit that they were able to see what God was doing through the ministry. But they had a problem. Their giving was maxed out at about 20% of their income. And because they had a large and growing family and private school and college to pay for, they simply didn't have any additional resources to give away unless they pulled money away from one of the other ministries they were giving to, which they were unwilling to do. So for 2 years, they tracked this ministry that they wanted to start giving to, but were unable. Well, then finally, an offer was made for their business. They had a liquidity event. And what was funny was what they were most excited about with the liquidation of the business was that it was going to provide a new pool of cash that was available for them to do some additional giving with. Top of their list was this ministry that they had fallen in love with and been tracking for 2 years. So I'll never forget, before the business sale closed, I was with them and they were having trouble even staying focused on the financial planning discussion. They were so excited about the giving that was about to happen, and particularly making a very large gift to this new ministry. Well, I couldn't wait to hear what happened. And when we met again, this was now a while after the business had closed, we got together, sat down at their dining room table, and the first question I asked them was, did you make the gift and how did it go? I couldn't wait to hear about the experience they had. And immediately, both husband and wife got really serious looks on their face. The husband looked at me and he said, Jim, we will never give another dime to that ministry. My heart was broken. I'm trying to figure out, how do you go from, I love this ministry, I can't wait to give money, and I'm so thankful to have more money coming in so I can make a significant gift. How do you get from there to, we will never give another dime to this ministry in one interaction with a major donor rep? So the answer to the question of why this workshop, why Ronald Blue Trust, I had started to realize that we've got all this experience counseling major donors, helping them to be more generous. And I realized that this particular client, they cut this ministry off. They honored the pledge that they made, but they never gave another dollar to the ministry. They were willing to share that story with me. And I'll give you the details in a little bit to let you know exactly what went wrong. But I realized they didn't call the major donor rep back. And I was thinking, if I was the executive director of that ministry, I would want to know what just happened. If I was a board member of that ministry, I would want to know what happened to take this perfect donor who is in love with our ministry and can't wait to give, to, after one interaction with one of our team members, cutting the ministry off completely. From my perspective, that's what started me along the path of wanting to provide training and help to folks that do the work that you do. You're all on the front lines of the mission. And I figured our donors, our clients are telling us things about the experiences that they're having that they're never telling the ministry leaders. So the point of this webinar is just to give you kind of a preview of some of the interaction we've had with our major donors over the years, the clients we've gotten to help be more generous, to share with you some of the things they've been telling us that they want from the ministries that they're interacting with. If you think about it, Ronald Blue Trust, our mission is to help Christians become financially free in order to assist in fulfilling the Great Commission. So in that sense, we're in the same business, if you will, as you all are. We're on the sending side. We're sitting down with the clients, helping them set financial finish lines, helping them to increase their generosity. You're on the receiving and deploying of those resources. But ultimately, it's still all about the mission of Jesus Christ. We're working together, and if we're able to provide information that's in any way helpful to you as you interact with and serve the financial partners God has raised up for you, ultimately more resources are going to flow into the kingdom as a result of it. One of the things I wanted to point out, most of the ministries, in fact, possibly all of the ministries that are participating this morning are faith-based ministries and serving a lot of Christian donors. Our experience is exclusively in that space, or just about exclusively in that space. We serve primarily wealthy Christians that have a heart for stewardship and generosity. That's what we're hired to help them with. But these concepts I'm going to be sharing, whether or not you have faith-based donors, these same concepts will prove to be true regardless for all of the folks who are contributing to your ministry. The other thing I wanted to say before we jump in, some of the concepts that I share will probably be very affirming to some because they'll fall perfectly in line with your natural wiring and the way that you've either done development or the way that you've wanted to. It's possible or even probable that some of the concepts that I share might cause a little bit of tension and even resistance because either you've been trained in a particular way of doing it or there's a different model that's in the DNA of your organization. All I would ask is that you try to keep an open mind as we go through these concepts because we're not talking about theory today. Everything I'm going to share with you is coming directly from the major donors, the folks that are out there contributing money to your ministries. So the three topics that we're going to talk about this morning, contrasting fundraising paradigms, two different models we'll look at, what we've observed over the last 40 years of helping wealthy Christians steward God's resources and be more generous, what we've observed over that period of time about major donors. And then we'll close with 4 hindrances to major gifts, 4 specific things that, if they are present or if they are absent, will hinder major donors from being more generous to your ministry. Let's start with a contrasting fundraising paradigms. There are 2 primary models. There are probably a number of different ways that development is practiced, but my experience has been that they pretty much fall into 2 different categories. There's what I call the transactional approach, paradigm 1, or the discipleship approach, paradigm 2. Discipleship approach is often also referred to as the transformational approach. So let's take a quick look at both of these and compare them. Paradigm 1, the transactional approach, focuses primarily on the donor's financial resources. It emphasizes the ministry's financial needs. Virtually every interaction with donors talks about this is what we need money for. That focus on the donor's financial resources, sometimes in conversations within a ministry, I've had donor reps tell me they start to feel like their donors are not even people. They're a wealth rating or they're a net worth or capacity to give score. They focus primarily on the financial resources, and there's this constant emphasis and interaction on ministries' financial needs. Therefore, in the transactional approach, it stresses the ask. At worst, to the extent that every single piece of correspondence from the ministry and what the reps are expected to do, every interaction must include an ask. And because that's true, in the transactional approach, success is defined by dollars raised or committed. In other words, if you go out and have a great interaction with a donor, but failed to ask for money, that is considered an unsuccessful. In some ministries, it's even considered a wasted interaction. And success, when you get back to the office, is did you get a check or did you get a commitment? So again, the transactional approach focuses primarily on the donor's financial resources, emphasizes the ministry's financial needs, stresses the ask. There always must be an ask, and success equals money raised or money committed. Now let's contrast that with the discipleship approach. The discipleship approach is focused not primarily on the donor's financial resources, but rather focused primarily on the donor's walk with Christ. The emphasis is not on the ministry's needs, but a constant discussion about the vision and the fruit, what God has called this ministry to do, and how God is providing fruit through the ministry. Instead of a constant ask for money, the discipleship approach is simply an invitation into partnership in whatever form the donor is interested in, walking with the donor as part of the mission. And therefore, success in this model is not measured in terms of did I get a check or did I get a commitment. Success in the discipleship model is a matter of the partner's spiritual growth, their maturity in Christ. Why? If you think about it logically, any follower of Jesus who is growing in their faith and maturing spiritually, generosity grows as a natural byproduct of us being conformed to the image of Jesus. In the discipleship model, the focus is on pouring into the financial partners God has raised up and help them to grow spiritually unto maturity. You don't have to focus on trying to raise money because somebody who's growing in their faith is automatically going to become more generous. So you've got two models, basically the transactional model and the discipleship model. Which is most effective? I have to tell you, to my dismay, the majority of faith-based ministries, and I would even say the majority of faith-based consulting firms, have adopted the transactional approach. By and large, most ministries that I talk to, that is what has been built into their training. And for some organizations, despite efforts to change it, it's built into the board perspective, it's built into the DNA of the organization. But the vast majority of major donors overwhelmingly prefer the discipleship model, and if you're not careful, will ultimately reject completely the transactional model. That's how major donors, no matter how much they love the ministry and what's being done there, will eventually just silently disappear and not be partners anymore. So if your organization has adopted the transactional model, I would respectfully suggest two actions. One is, I would suggest doing some research on your donor attrition rate, because you might end up discovering the fact that that model is actually causing you to lose good donors at least as readily as you're able to bring new ones in the front door. And I would also suggest, if you're using this model, request permission to transition your own donor relationships to more of a discipleship model. I've met so many really, really good major donor reps who feel like their hands are tied because they have a heart to do discipleship. They absolutely know that's the most effective way to work with financial partners, but the organization resists that idea because the transactional model is what is built into the way that the ministry operates. So if that describes you as we go through and look at the discipleship model and how to employ it, be willing to ask permission to, at least for the folks that you interact with, the folks that God's given you to serve personally, see if you can incorporate some of these principles into those relationships. So let's start with what we've learned, what we've observed over the years about major donors. We'll talk about who they are, what they want, what they don't want, and what major donor concerns look like in the current generation. What we've observed about major donors are stewardship conscious. Now, again, we're talking about primarily donors to faith-based ministries, evangelical organizations. They are stewardship conscious, which means they are not simply giving money for the sake of the joy they experience in giving money. It's not just a matter of obedience to God's word and Christ's teaching, but they also see it as a matter of responsibility. And for that reason, because it's not just giving to give, they feel a sense of responsibility for what happens to the money they give and which organizations they're giving money to. Because it's a stewardship transaction, they feel a level of responsibility for there being fruit. If they're not seeing fruit, or they're not being told about the fruit the ministry's generating, they're probably going to end up going someplace else. Major donors to faith-based organizations are intensely stewardship conscious. They recognize it is not their money. The money belongs to God. And because it belongs to God, they feel this sense of responsibility as a steward, even for the portion of the resources that they're giving away. Major donors are kingdom focused, which means that They give to a variety of kingdom causes. If you're not already aware of this, I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad tidings, but every major donor you serve is also giving money to other ministries. Major donors who are giving out of obedience to Christ and a love for the mission, they're always looking for new opportunities to give, and they like to diversify their giving. They're always going to be giving to other organizations. Major donors are intensely vision-driven. They're driven by the vision. What is it that God has raised your ministry up to do? That's what needs to be kept front and center. They long to be part of something that's bigger than themselves. They long to be part of something that they could not personally fund it themselves. But it's going to take a whole bunch of followers of Christ pooling their resources together to go and do what it is that God has laid on the ministry's heart to do. Ecclesiastes 3:11 says, God has set eternity in the hearts of men. These major donors, they're driven by vision. They're not driven by ask. They're not driven by a constant dialogue about the ministry's needs. They're driven by the vision. What is it that God has raised this ministry up to do? And finally, major donors are often disguised as minor donors. This is one of the most important points we're probably going to talk about all day. So I want you to take special care of this particular one, because virtually every training event I've ever done in the last 15 years, the first question that comes up by the ministry leaders is, we love our grassroots donors and we're doing pretty well at continuing to attract them, but God's given us a big vision and we really need more major donors. So the question I'm asked is, where do we find more major donors? My answer is always the same. It's simple. They are already in your existing database. The best place to look for new major donors is in your existing base of donors who have given money to the ministry. Let me give you an example of how major donors are often disguised as minor donors. Friend Dr. George, who came to me a number of years back for counsel, he was retired, and in retirement between his pension and Social Security was making about $100,000 a year. And of that, he was giving at 23%. So $23,000 a year, he was already joyfully giving away. And the reason that he wanted to meet with me is to look at his financial situation, because he wanted to give even more. So he wanted somebody to sit down with him and help him figure out whether he could give more, and if so, how much. One of the most joyful folks that I've ever got to serve. And it's funny, when you're in a room with this man, he just exudes Jesus Christ and generosity. He never really enjoyed talking about financial matters until the topic of generosity came up. So we're together, I've got his tax return out, and something struck me in his tax return. There's the itemized list of all the ministries that he had given money to in the prior year. And of the $23,000 given away, there were 35 total ministries that had received money from this particular donor. 35 ministries. And what was surprising to me is at the top of the list, there were 3 ministries that received very large gifts. His church got $10,000 of the $23,000. And there were 2 ministries that I was very familiar with that he had loved and served and worked with for many, many years. Each of those were getting $5,000. So if you do the math, $20,000 of the 23 total was going to just 3 ministries. So Dr. George is a major donor to 3 ministries, which meant there were 32 ministries that were receiving some portion of the remaining $3,000 he was giving away. And when I started going down the list, some of the ministries I had heard of, some of them I had no idea who they were or what they did. But there were ministries on the list that were getting $100, $50 a year, $25 a year, a lot of them. A lot of those ministries were getting less than $100. And I remember kind of the efficiency gene kicking in, and I said, wouldn't it be more efficient and probably less tedious to, instead of dividing the rest of that money between 32 different ministries, to just pick 1 or 2 that you really like and give the $3,000 there so it could have more significant impact? You know what he said to me? He said, I couldn't bear to cut them off. I would feel bad if I cut them off. There were ministries on the list that for 40 years, from the beginning of his career when he didn't have any money at all, he had started supporting it $25 a year, $50 a year. And because he was such a small donor, there was never any engagement or relationship with the ministry. So here you've got your dream donor, a donor who goes to a financial advisor who shares his faith and biblical worldview to help him figure out how to be even more generous. But there are 32 ministries that have this large major donor in their database who have never interacted with him because they don't know that he's there. They have no idea the capacity to give and the desire to give. Now, it's interesting with this particular donor. We immediately, just with the initial planning, he doubled his giving the first year, doubled it again to $80,000 the second year. And he was having so much fun giving away more money that we finally started giving away out of his investment portfolio. The point is, this perfect donor was sitting in 32 databases and being completely ignored because nobody knew what the capacity was. Nobody had ever personally engaged him. Major donors are often disguised as minor donors. And if part of your strategic plan is increasing your base of major donors, the first place to look is in your existing database because they are there. Okay, what do major donors want in the interaction that they have with ministry leaders or with the major donor rep professionals that they're dealing with? Absolute top of the chart, what major donors want is a personal relationship. The largest gifts and the most consistent giving over time will always come from a personal relationship with someone at the ministry. It could be the development professional. That could be the relationship. It might be somebody on the board or the executive director, somebody on staff that they know well. But the largest dollars and by far the longest term commitments are directly tied to a personal relationship. It's interesting. I had an experience along these lines with a client where there's a particular people group, a ministry need that they've always had a heart for. And there are two ministries that they were giving to that both did the same type of work. But there was a vast difference in these ministries in terms of one was huge. You would all know it if I mentioned the name, doing an incredible work. They were an international ministry in scope at this point. They were receiving what would be qualified as major gifts from the client. There was another small regional ministry that didn't have nearly as broad of a reach, but was also doing incredible work for Christ among the same type of needs in people groups. So they have two ministries, one very large, one that was much smaller. They're giving exactly the same size gift to both. And I was having a discussion with them and we were talking through their giving strategy. And they made this comment to me. They said, we've made a decision that we're going to stop giving to what was the larger ministry so that we can double up our giving to the smaller ministry. And I said, that's interesting what motivated the decision, because I know people at the larger ministry. I know the fruit, and they're doing incredible work. And I couldn't think of any reason that a donor would ever want to cut off that particular ministry. And I probed for a reason, and they were struggling to articulate it. And then finally they said, we just don't think they really need our money, but we know that this other ministry needs our money. Now, that might sound fairly simplistic, but here's what I knew that didn't come up in the discussion. About a month earlier, one of them had a pretty significant surgery. And I mean, our team was praying for them. And I called, we knew when it was supposed to be over. I called the other spouse just to check in and see how it had gone. And what was funny is when I called, they were tied up on the phone. The person they were tied up on the phone with actually turned out to be the executive director of that smaller ministry. And it wasn't a game. It wasn't manipulation. That was the relationship they had. Their ministry representative had become a friend, a prayer partner, cared very much for this family, and was never in fundraising mode, but just pouring into them. The point is, the personal relationship because I had even asked him the question, I said, referring to the larger ministry, who is your representative at that ministry? Because I thought it might be somebody I knew. They said, come to think of it, we don't actually have a relationship with anybody at that ministry. Now think about that. It's a large ministry, granted, but this is a major donor, and they had been a major donor for years to this ministry, but they didn't have a personal relationship and never had with anybody at the ministry. Personal relationship is extremely important. Another thing that major donors want is authenticity, passion, and conviction. When they have a personal relationship or really any interaction with somebody from the ministry, they want to see authenticity, they want to see passion for the vision, and they want to see conviction about what's happening there. And friends, you cannot fake this. This is so important. I've counseled a lot of major donor reps over the years that they might have had this when they started, but something happened over the years that it cooled. If you are not still fired up, excited about the ministry you're representing, my counsel would be consider spending some time before the Lord in prayer and seeing if maybe there's another ministry that you ought to be serving. Because a major donor rep, a professional who is lacking in authentic passion and conviction about the ministry, donors know that immediately. It's not neutral. It's actually going to have a negative effect on the fundraising practices of the ministry. This is really important, and it's really important to be able to convey it when you're interacting with the financial partners God has raised up. The third thing that major donors want, this is increasingly true, and I would say specifically it's increasing exponentially in the last couple of decades, is hands-on involvement. They don't just want to be financial partners to the ministry. Increasingly, there's an interest in being involved personally, physically, in some way with the ministry. Great example of this, one of my colleagues was sharing, they were meeting with one of their clients. Again, another very, very generous family, major donors to many, many ministries. And they had always gotten really excited whenever they had the giving strategy discussion. But the advisor was sitting with them and they were talking about giving strategy and some large gifts they had just made. And he noticed that they didn't seem to be anywhere near as excited as they usually were in this discussion. So he asked them, what's going on? What happened? You don't seem to be overly enthusiastic about the giving you just did. And the wife looked and said, sometimes we feel like all we are is a blank check. That kind of a comment is representative of a donor who desperately wants to be more involved in the ministry than simply sitting back and writing checks. This is especially true of two groups. One is next gen and the other is retirees. Incidentally, over the years, as I've gotten together with ministry leaders and development professionals, reaching the next generation has become a huge concern for many organizations because as my parents' generation, which was extremely generous, and the baby boomer generation, which was maybe a little bit less generous on a percentage basis, but is still pouring a lot of money into the kingdom. Once you get past the baby boomer generation, most ministries are having a great deal of trouble connecting with the next generation. And there's a huge concern about once the baby boomer generation dies off, if Jesus hadn't come back by then, how are they going to connect with the next generation? Here is how. The next generation is not nearly as interested in writing a check or responding to an ask as they are volunteering their time initially. Once they look into the eyes of the ministry beneficiaries, once they're able to physically experience what God's doing in and through the ministry, they will gladly open the checkbook and give financially. I started to notice this a while back. Part of my personal ministry has always been doing discipleship, typically with young men in their 20s. And always stewardship and generosity are among the things that I spend time talking with them about. And I started to notice a trend. It wasn't that they weren't interested in giving or generosity, but I started to see these young men, when they became interested in a ministry, before they were willing to write a check, they would want to go and meet people that worked in the ministry, and they would want to go out. I had several instances where at their own cost, they went out on a short-term missions trip or vision trip just so they could experience what the ministry was doing and the results of the way that God was working through it. Again, the checkbook will follow, but so many folks now are looking for hands-on involvement as opposed to just sitting there writing checks and having no other involvement. The other group besides the next generation that this is huge for is retirees. If you look at the baby boomer generation, as we move into and through retirement, there is a tremendous opportunity to engage some of these folks, your major donors who, as they exit the workforce and move into retirement, oftentimes are looking for something to do. They've got time on their hands. A lot of these folks are incredibly skilled and talented and visionary and strategic, and they're available. They've got time available now that they've never had before. I had an example, one of my clients that I was coaching, we were preparing for retirement. And at Ron Blue, one of the things that we always try to do when we're walking through that season of life with a client is to say it's really important to plan for what's on the other side. Retiring to something instead of retiring from something. This guy was a business leader, an executive, an incredibly skilled strategic thinker. But what was funny is we were having trouble having the what are you retiring to discussion because he had been so busy and traveling so much that all he could think about was he loved golf and he hardly ever got to play. So every time I started talking about what happens on the other side, because that day's quickly approaching, all he could say is, Jim, I have no idea. All I want to do is play golf. It was so funny. So he retired. And 2 weeks after he was retired, we're having a discussion and he said, I'm so sick of golf. I thought I could play golf every day. I'm tired of playing golf. He was completely bored. He had responsibility for running a huge organization and all of this talent and skill and generosity. He had been very, very generous. All of a sudden is sitting at home with nothing to do. Let me tell you what happened. He goes to church. Somebody at church hands him one of those old VCR tape, a video that was made by a Christian production firm specifically for the purpose of evangelism. To be honest with you, I watched it. It was not incredibly well made, but it was absolutely clear on Jesus Christ, who he is, why he came. It was a depiction of a family, real life, and it led up to, at the end, evangelism. And it actually invited the audience to repent and trust in Jesus Christ as Savior and Lord. Well, if anybody I've ever met had the spiritual gift of evangelism, it was this man. He's sitting at home by himself in his living room. He watches this video and he says, everybody's got to see this. I have to do something. He goes, again, at his own expense, he goes to meet with a production company. He wanted to hear their personal testimony to make sure that they were legitimately just focused on evangelism and not profiteering. He had 2 meetings with them. He came back more excited than he was after watching the movie. Here's what he did. He used his own money. He bought caseloads of this video. He started going around his town to every church and he made them this offer. I'll provide the video. What I want you to do is a community outreach movie night. I'll provide whatever you need. I'll provide the screen. I'll provide food, drinks, whatever you want to provide. I'll provide the movie. The agreement is this is not an in-reach. This is not for your church members. This is an opportunity to have a movie night where you invite folks in the community that don't go to church. He was having so much fun. And after he had hit every church he was aware of, he started getting calls from the churches that took him up on it of all these people that were coming to faith in Christ through this movie ministry. He was so excited. He actually had a second home up in the mountains. And during the part of the year that he spent up there, he did the exact same thing. He loaded up his garage with cases of the tapes, started taking them around to churches and making the same offer. What's the point? Here's the point. He desperately wanted hands-on involvement with a ministry he was interested in. Who asked him to do that? Nobody. You've got a gifted, skilled executive with a whole career worth of experience evangelizing, strategic planning, talking to people and ministry leaders about how to share Jesus, sitting at home, all of that skill and talent with nothing to do. You've got donors in your database that are incredibly skilled and gifted. They're generous, but now they're at a season in life where they have time available that they haven't had before, and they're at their peak in terms of experience, just acquired skill. They would probably love to be involved in some way. And it doesn't have to be, can you join our board for the rest of your life? In fact, many will shy away from that. But if you're putting together an ad hoc strategic planning committee, or even putting together a group to think through what donor development will look like in the next 5 to 10 years, Or you've got opportunities at your facility for folks to come and volunteer. Don't overlook the possibility of inviting your major donors who are now retired to come out and actually experience what the ministry is doing. And the other thing that major donors want, what major donors insist on, is there must be fruit. There must be results. I mean, a lot of ministry leaders and development professionals will talk about what they perceive as kind of competition for donor dollars. And reality is, there are tons of faith-based nonprofits out there, and there are many who are probably doing a very similar work to the one that you're doing. If the donors don't start to perceive that there is fruit, that God is powerfully at work in and through this ministry, if they're not being made aware of the actual results, what is happening, who are the beneficiaries, and how are their lives being impacted, they will eventually quietly go away. The good part is when there is fruit, there are results and they are being reported, and I mean front and center in interactions with donors. That's what they respond to, vision and fruit. What you'll find is they will enthusiastically share with their friends what God is doing in and through the ministry. There are so many times that I'll get together with a client and the starting point of the conversation will be one of the ministries they're supporting and how excited they are because they just got back from a ministry update, a vision event, and they can't wait to tell me about what God's doing in and through the ministry. At some point, there have got to be fruit and results, and when there are, they must be reported. These are 4 things that your major donors want. Now let's talk about what your major donors don't want. Top of the list is more mailings. It's funny, some of us are old enough to remember when there was no such thing as the internet or email, and if a ministry wanted to communicate, besides using the telephone, all they could do is send something, a hard copy in the mail. And I remember when email started to be used more broadly, I used to think how great that was going to be for ministries because it would be far less expensive and a much more efficient way of communicating. So I kind of thought hard copy mailings might go away and be replaced by email. What happened is most ministries just doubled up. They continued to do hard copy mailing and they started doing monthly email blasts to the same people. Major donors do not want more mailings. Most go unread. And that's what it's troubling to think of how much money is spent on these things that are not going to be read. In some cases might just be thrown away. But from my perspective, when I'm talking to major donors about this issue, I always ask a follow-up question because I'm really interested to know. I tell them the ministry needs to be able to correspond with you. They have a responsibility to let you know what's going on in the ministry. So if not more mailings, or if doing away with existing mailings, what do you prefer? How would you prefer for the ministries to contact you and to share information on what God is doing through the ministry? By and large, here's the response. 1 page maximum, half a page is better. So it's not we don't want anything. We don't mind hearing from you, but make it short and concise and cover the main details. And bullet points are preferable to really long. In some cases, you might see a 2-3 page account just of one family. I'm not saying no one will read that. There are certainly a small percentage of folks that are wired to do that. But for the most part, a very short mailing that is clear and to the point that when they open it, if it's sent electronically, they know I can consume this in 60 seconds and move on. It's not that they don't want to hear, it's they don't want these 4-page mailings or these really long emailed newsletters. Again, most are going to go unread. And remember, because major donors are kingdom-minded, they are not just getting mailing after mailing from your organization. Every organization they're supporting is doing the same thing. That's why so often, if they look at it and it's too long to be able to consume very quickly, they're not even going to bother. Another thing that major donors do not want, this is becoming an increasingly big issue and item of discussion, duplication of effort. This is something that when I think about interacting with clients who are major donors 20, 25 years ago, I don't remember this being discussed very often, but this is something that is discussed with increasing frequency now. Duplication of effort, here's what it looks like. If you imagine in your city, you go downtown into your city, and let's say you park out front of a homeless shelter. it's entirely possible that if you get out of the car and start walking, that particular homeless shelter, soup kitchen that's trying to provide for the homeless in that community, go 2 blocks down the street, there might be another one. And this one is maybe founded and sponsored by a local church or a denomination. And if you go around the block, there may be another one that is part of a U.S.-wide organization that is trying to serve the homeless in every city. And then you go down that block and you'll find another one sponsored by a different denomination. This kind of stuff is driving major donors crazy now because it is so inefficient when they see multiple different organizations serving the exact same constituents in the exact same areas. So one of the things I would suggest you do, just kind of keeping this in the back of your mind, is if you're aware of there being a lot of duplication of effort, make sure you're aware of if there are differences between the way your organization does it and what the other folks are doing. You need to be willing to address this, and sometimes you need to be willing to be the one to bring it up. Because the donor, remember, donors will not often bring to ministry leaders' attention the things they're concerned about. They just quietly go away and stop giving to the ministry. You need to be able to engage them in discussion and uncover some of these things. So if there's duplication, if this is an issue for your ministry, you need to look at what are the differences between the way that we're doing it and the other folks are doing it so that you can lead with it and make sure they understand there is a distinction between what you're doing and the other folks. I would also suggest seriously consider collaborating, looking for opportunities to merge a local ministry with the efforts of other organizations. I know that's not something that the Church of Jesus Christ or the kingdom is very familiar with. Usually we're accustomed to everybody operating in their own silo. But an awful lot of money could be saved on overhead, meaning an awful lot of additional dollars deployed to the ministry beneficiaries if we can eliminate a lot of the duplication of effort. But be aware of this because this is on the mind of an increasing number of your donors. Whether they talk about it or not, it's something that they're probably thinking about. Another thing major donors do not want. This one I'm going to put again in the category of one of the most important things we're going to talk about today. What major donors do not want is the aggressive pursuit of follow-up gifts. The aggressive pursuit of follow-up gifts. Any of you who have done research on giving trends have probably come across the studies that show you why this has become such a big issue. I mean, the numbers right now are somewhere in the 20% range, meaning when you finally acquire a new donor, only 20% of new donors to a ministry ever make a second gift. And if you can get a second gift, once you get a second gift from a donor, it increases the probability to 60% that they will continue giving over a period of time. So a lot of ministry leaders and major donor professionals are realizing if I want to increase the probability of this being a long-term relationship, I can increase the probability from 20% to over 60% by getting the second gift. But unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, most ministries are using this transactional model. It's basically a sales-based model. You make the appeal, you do the ask, you're trained to overcome objections to get to yes, to get to the sale. So the aggressive pursuit of follow-up gifts, some ministries are deploying their best salespeople to try to go get that second gift. Let me tell you why this is a really, really troubling idea and why this is causing so many donors to go away forever. Do you remember the example I gave you at the very beginning of this discussion? Clients that I was serving, they couldn't wait for the business to sell so they could make a large lump sum gift to a ministry that they had been longing to support for a couple of years. This is what happened. Here's kind of the rest of that story. I'm sitting at the table with them. The husband makes the comment, "We will never give another dime to this ministry." And I asked them, what in the world happened? They called the ministry because they had never had contact with them before. They talked to somebody in fundraising and they told them they would like to make a gift of this amount. And they made the gift. They got a call back almost immediately from the major donor rep who served their area. So when they're telling me the story, they're telling me about their experience, They said within 24 hours, we got a call back from the rep for our area. We couldn't wait to meet him. He called and said, I'm going to be in your area next week. I'd love to come by and just get together with you and thank you personally for your generous gift. That, incidentally, is the perfect approach. So what happened? They said, we greeted him at the door. We walked in together. He sat down, Jim, right in the seat that you're sitting at. If he said thank you, we missed it. Neither of us heard it. Possible that he might have said thank you, but neither one of us heard it. What he did was he opened his briefcase and pulled out a bunch of brochures, and he started talking for 30 minutes about all of the needs the ministry had. And then at the end of it, he actually said, I want to challenge you to make an X dollar gift to this new project. Now, think of the horror of the folks who had just given the largest gift they had ever given to any ministry outside of their church, the biggest gift they had ever given. And what they were greeted by was not thank you, we love you, how can we pray for you? What they were greeted with is, I'm going to challenge you to give an even bigger gift than the last one. And understandably, they had no other businesses to sell. They were absolutely heartbroken, frustrated, and devastated. And know what? From my perspective, I was heartbroken for them. The exact same thing happened to another client 6 months later. It wasn't as bad with the initial interaction, but the second interaction kind of sealed it for them. It was the same situation. They had a liquidity event pending. There was a pool of those resources that were already earmarked for charitable giving. They had decided they wanted to identify new ministries to give to instead of just increasing support of the folks they were already supporting. So ahead of the liquidity event, they did a bunch of research. One particular ministry, again, it's one you all know, they were captivated by what God was doing through this ministry. The more they studied, the more they learned, the more excited they got. They actually called the ministry after the liquidity event, and they made a 3-year huge pledge. Each year, the gift was larger than any gift they had ever made in their life, any single gift, and they pledged that same amount for 3 consecutive years. That is a serious gift. Same thing happened. They got a call back from the major donor rep who was in their region, asking if he could come by, take them to lunch to show the ministry's appreciation and to get to know them a little bit better. Perfect approach. They got together the next week for lunch, and this was a textbook, perfect interaction, perfect follow-up. The whole discussion was getting to know them, getting to know about the kids, getting to know about their interests and their work. It was just a perfect meeting, but it was a setup because a week later, unexpectedly, they got another call from the same rep who said, hey, I'm in town again. I wondered if we could get together again. There's something I wanted to talk to you about. Second meeting, unexpected. They didn't know what to say, so they invited him to come over to the house. Comes over to the house, briefcase comes out, brochures spread across the table, and even the same wording. I'm going to challenge you to make a gift of X number of dollars. Because, of course, he's thinking if they could afford to give this amount 3 years in a row, they're probably capable of giving way more than that. They were so offended and they were so appalled by the second interaction, this aggressive pursuit of a follow-up gift. I think it was a Friday that he came over. They called me first thing Monday morning as their financial advisor. They said, look at our portfolio. You find a way to meet our 3-year pledge right now because we do not ever want to talk to anybody from that ministry again. Now, friends, all I can tell you is that ministry was and is doing incredible work in the name of Jesus Christ, impacting lives, not just in the United States, all over the world. The executive director of that ministry would love to have known what happened, but never would. The board of that ministry should long to learn what happened, but they never would. They didn't call the donor rep back. They didn't want to talk to the donor rep again. Aggressive pursuit of follow-up gifts is a good way to immediately end the relationship. If there is anything I was going to kind of strongly, urgently implore you to consider, if this has become a practice in your organization, be very, very careful because major donors in droves are running away from ministries that are doing this. And final thing that major donors do not want is what I call the hat-in-hand approach to solicitation. The hat-in-hand approach, that's basically we're really in financial trouble, usually again. We're really in financial trouble and we really need help, almost like begging. The hat-in-hand approach to solicitation oftentimes will trigger a small gift, if at all, but think about it from the donor's perspective because, we're early in the year now, but as we get toward the end of the year, there are probably ministry leaders on this call who, whether you want to do this or not, your ministry is become accustomed to sending out the year-end appeal, and the year-end appeal basically says something like this. Our budget this year is X number of dollars, but so far we've only taken in this amount of money, which is considerable shortfall. The shortfall is outlined, and it basically conveys, unless you step up to the plate, unless you help us here, we're going to have to either maybe let go some staff. We're going to have to, whatever bad thing you can imagine. We're going to have to let people go. We're going to have to start cutting back on services to our constituents. Almost in a sense, we're in financial straits right now. We really need help. Somebody's got to bail us out. Now think about this. I'm not saying if you have a one-time financial crisis, don't let folks know about it. What I'm saying is some ministries, this is a way of life. Every single year, it's the same template. Some of the words change and the numbers change, but it's the same thing. It's a year-end hat-in-hand approach to solicitation. And for some ministries where finances are particularly tight, every ask and every appeal feels this way. Now, put yourself in the seat of a major donor who is a partner in your ministry. And imagine that you have received the hat-in-hand letter from a ministry, and you're thinking, wait a minute, they were in trouble last year. Wait, hold it. They were in trouble the year before that. What that conveys is that you're in trouble, you're always in trouble. It tells them either the ministry cannot manage its finances, or it says that God must not be at work in this ministry if the giving is drying up. Because God doesn't have a problem with resources. God doesn't have trouble providing resources for a ministry that is doing his work and having an impact. So the hat-in-hand approach, again, if anything, it may trigger small gifts, typically will not trigger major gifts. And if it does ever trigger a major gift, the second time it happens, there's a good chance the donor's eventually going to go away because the donor is under the impression, probably the very real impression, this is a ministry that is always in financial trouble. I need to be giving God's resources to a ministry that's actually managing the resources better. So that's what major donors do not want from you. Now let's talk about major donor concerns. These are the things that our clients over the years continually talk about as a frustration, things that they're concerned about in the interactions they have with the ministries that they support. Top of the list, major donor concerns is solicitation overload. This really was triggered by the internet age and the ease of solicitation electronically. And as I said before, a lot of ministries continued doing the hard copy solicitation, and they're also supplementing it now with various electronic solicitations as well. Major donors, our clients will use terms like bombarded, overwhelmed, and wasteful, especially when there's a steady diet of both electronic and hard copy solicitation letters. They consider that to be a waste of resources by the organization. I'll give you a great example of this just from a recent discussion I had. I was sitting with a major donor at a donor event, and we were talking about a different ministry, not the event we were at. And what they had shared was the largest gifts they had ever given and the longest, it had been over 20 years, they had been supporting this ministry. The reason they brought it up is we were having a donor experience at this event that was incredibly well done. And it triggered in them a discussion about a really bad experience they just had with their favorite ministry that they had been given to for the longest period of time, and they were significant donors to. Here's what the wife said: we're about ready to cut them off. We're about ready to cut them off. Our favorite giving ministry, we're about ready to cut them off. Why? They had been a month earlier to the annual major donor event. They had made another significant 3-year pledge to this ministry. As soon as they got home, like within a week, they got the typical monthly letter with an ask and a little card so they could check, will you give $25, $50, or $100? And the box with a blank, so if you want to give more than $100, you could fill in an amount. They had just pledged what amounted to a couple of $100,000 over the next 3 years, and within a week, they get another solicitation for a small gift. They started saving. They got frustrated because they got another one. They decided to count. Over the next 3 months, when they got them, they put them in a stack. This particular ministry has several different facets. It's all kind of mercy ministry based. There are different constituencies that they serve. They were getting bombarded with solicitations like this from every division in that ministry. They counted literally a dozen solicitations in a 3-month time period. Every one of them had an ask. Every one of them had a pledge card, and every one of them had a return envelope to one of the largest donors this organization probably had. Be very, very careful about solicitation overload. Remember, major donors are giving to tons of different ministries, and they're getting bombarded, not just maybe by your ministry, I hope not, but if they are, they're getting it from all corners. Another thing that major donors are increasingly concerned about is emotional manipulation. We've all experienced this from things that we've gotten in the mail. Emotional manipulation, just an example of how this works. This is when you get, might not even be a letter that you open, but a postcard in the mail from an organization with a picture of an emaciated child on the front of it. And no matter what the verbiage says, what it conveys is, if you don't send a check, this kid's going to die. That's emotional manipulation. And I would say to you, I think it's possible, maybe probable back in the 80s, 90s, that approach worked because there were not that many organizations using it. But now a lot of organizations are using it. And if that's what they're using as their primary trigger when they're mailing to their donors are getting a constant series of these emotionally manipulating appeals saying, if you don't send back a check, something really bad is going to happen to this person. I give you an example that recently this came from a major donor professional who is a supporter of another ministry. He went to their major donor event because he loves the ministry, but because he's in development himself, he was very observant of how they ran the event, how they cared for and served their donors. And he was sharing with me a story that he was still in disbelief. They had a perfect evening. They served a nice dinner, shared nothing but vision and fruit, interviewed some beneficiaries of the ministry. It was honestly, they were ministered to. The message was not a message about ministry needs and an appeal for a gift. The message was from God's word, pouring into them their spiritual growth and nourishing their souls. Honestly, it was the perfect major donor event until the end. And at the end, bait and switch, the head of development stood up to give the closing message. The closing message was an ask. The ask was, obviously, there's an envelope and there are pledge cards in the middle of the table. Here's what the head of development had done. This particular ministry in the Midwest, they serve homeless families, specifically single moms with kids. So they're not focused on homeless folks, generally speaking, but specifically single moms with kids who are left out on the street. Wonderful ministry and wonderful work. Well, they had done an awful lot of research to determine how many single mom families are homeless in our county. And then they looked at their budget and they looked at what is the cost for us to get each one of them off the street, and quantified the cost to rescue a family in essence. But then he stood up and he addressed the crowd as if it was their fault these folks were out there. And here's what he said in closing. There are this many families that are still out on the street homeless. They don't have a place to live. They've got kids they're trying to care for. They don't have money. They don't have food. Here's my question to you. Here's my challenge to you tonight. How many of those families are you willing to allow to stay out on the street? There was deafening silence in the room. Everybody was in disbelief. I personally don't know what the result was in terms of the fundraising, but I can tell you from serving Christian major donors for decades, they lost an awful lot of supporters that night. Emotional manipulation may get a gift out of guilt, typically a smaller gift than otherwise would have been given, but a whole bunch of donors are going to quietly go away if they feel emotionally manipulated to make a gift. Another concern that major donors share is this one: contact equals solicitation. Contact equals solicitation. They know whether it's an email, a phone call, a meeting with a ministry leader, a donor event, they know, even if it's a piece of mail, it's going to ask for money. Every interaction. It's interesting. I've always said that for major donors, they consider God's greatest gift to major donors to be caller ID, because they didn't have to keep taking these calls. They could eventually just stop, because they knew if a representative from a ministry I'm giving to is calling me, the only reason they're calling me is they need money now. The only time I ever hear from anybody or talk to anybody is when they're asking for money. Boy, this is the counter opposite of the discipleship model, where very few of the interactions are ever going to revolve around finances, because it's a caring for and walking with a fellow follower of Jesus Christ and pouring into them spiritually and caring for their family as you walk with them. And a fourth major donor concern, this is one I need to share. It makes me feel bad for the ministries, because a lot of times this is out of your control. But it's framed as a lack of financial efficiency. More and more donors are starting to look at annual reports. I mean, I've got clients who never in a million years would have looked at an annual report, and they're looking at them now, and they're specifically looking at the budget accounting because they've been hearing from other ministries that you need to look at what percentage of the funds raised is going to overhead. And they've actually created this kind of false paradigm that the less money a ministry is spending on operations and overhead, they are automatically a better ministry and more effective and more efficient than other ministries that maybe have a higher percentage of their revenue funding the operations. It's really interesting. I've actually recently found myself defending a ministry. It's odd to me because it's a ministry I'm very familiar with, because I have clients who support them. I don't support the ministry, but I do think they do an incredible work. But I had a client I was talking to who was had learned about this ministry, started doing research, was getting ready to write a pretty substantial check, but looked at the annual report and saw that their percentage overhead was higher than he thought it should have been. He had in his head from some of the smaller ministries he supported that it should be something in the ballpark of 90% or more of the funding should go directly to the beneficiaries. Well, in this particular ministry, because of the work they did, they were pretty high overhead. They were in the mid-70s, and he was going to not fund them for that reason alone. And I found myself saying, let's just do a comparison. There's a homeless shelter in your city. The building that they are renting is given almost for free, owned by the city, who appreciates them being there. It's a church that is actually running the ministry exclusively with volunteers, and the food they're providing is being gifted as well by local businesses. That is doing a great work. That is an inherently inexpensive operation because the overhead is almost non-existent. Food's given for free, staffed with volunteers, and the facility they're working out of costs them almost nothing. This other ministry, in an effort to get food and medical supplies to the poorest third world countries and remote villages and jungles, needs specially equipped aircraft that can be filled with food and medical supplies, and it kind of reminds me of like the Concorde, almost able for the airplanes to go straight up and to land in a clearing where there is no airstrip. There's just got to be a big enough spot to land for the plane to fit. Friends, that is an inherently more costly form of ministry. And it doesn't make it worse than the inner city homeless ministry. It's just different. But what's happening is smaller ministries that have very low overhead, their professionals have been trained to lead with this issue. And they probably should. If they're able to run very efficiently and the majority of the resources raised go directly to the beneficiaries, it makes sense that they would want to talk about that. And so they do. But what happens is now your major donors who are also interacting with other ministries, all of a sudden they have a heightened level of awareness about something they never even looked at before. So suggestion, first you need to know what your overhead cost is. And obviously, we are all stewards of God's resources. None of them belong to us. So every ministry should be trying to operate as efficiently as it possibly can. So under the assumption that your ministry is already as efficient as it can be, you need to know what your cost of overhead is, and you need to know why it is what it is and be willing and able to explain that to major donors. And if you're in that category like the ministry I talked about, where maybe 75% or 80% of what comes in gets to the beneficiaries because the cost of operation is higher, don't look at that as a weakness or a problem, but bring it up, lead with it. Know what it is, know why it is that way. And even if the donor doesn't bring it up, you have to be willing to, because more and more of your major donors, this is in their head now. It's in their head that cheaper is necessarily better. You could end up losing valuable major donors who love what you're doing just because nobody ever explained to them why the overhead was the way that it is. So donors are on the lookout for financial efficiency. You need to be willing to enter into this space because it is probably in the back of every major donor's mind. So that's what we've observed about major donors. Let's go into the last section now, which is 4 hindrances to major gifts. Some of these areas probably could be an entire webinar on their own. And I know some of the folks that are joining us today have been through other levels of training that we've done. So some of these concepts might be a little bit familiar. But I'm going to go through 4 areas, what I would consider to be the 4 most significant hindrances to major donors increasing their giving or making very large lump sum gifts or pledges to your ministry. 4 hindrances to major gifts. Number 1 is lack of clarity. Lack of clarity. The ministry mission and vision are not clearly articulated and continually reinforced. When the donor starts to lack clarity about what God has raised you up to do and how he is working through the ministry, the donor is going to start to drift. It'll get fuzzy initially, maybe lose interest a little bit, and then other appeals they're hearing from other ministries are going to start to get through. But what I found is there are a lot of people working for ministries that really struggle to even articulate the mission and the vision. This is particularly true for ministries that are using that transactional model because they're so used to talking about here are our needs and here is the ask. The whole focus is about outlining the needs so that we can ask for money. There's never a discussion about the God-given mission of this ministry and the fruit and results. When the mission and vision are not clearly articulated, continually reinforced with donors, eventually they're going to drift away. They're going to lose interest emotionally. They're going to feel less and less attached because the thing that drives them is the mission and vision. So make sure that your leadership, at the very least, and your entire development team, make sure that anybody in the ministry that has interfaces with your donors is able to clearly articulate the mission and vision. Never assume they already get it. There are times when I've had this discussion with major donor reps where they feel like I've had the discussion a lot of times with them. They know who we are. They know what we do. They know what's happening. Major donors are constantly hearing from numerous other nonprofits. And those nonprofits that are doing development properly are constantly emphasizing the mission and the fruit, the mission and the fruit. So they're casting vision, your donors are being engaged. The bottom line is this, for the development professionals, don't ever assume they already get it and they don't need to hear it. Think about it ourselves. I mean, how often do we have a missionary come to our home church and share what God's doing in and through the ministry? That never gets old. People sharing their personal testimony about how they came to faith in Jesus. I never get tired of it. You never get tired of it. Don't assume that your major donors will get bored or get tired of hearing about it. It's the vision, it's the mission that God has given you and their role in contributing to it. That's the thing that keeps them attached and engaged. So lack of clarity is a significant hindrance to major gifts. And the second follows directly, lack of engagement. The term I usually use for this is heart engagement at the heart level. That is an entirely different place for a donor to live than I'm a blank check. All I do is write financial support for the ministry. When there's a lack of engagement, there are a couple of things that cause it. One is an absence of volunteer activities or serving activities. We talked about that earlier. More and more major donors want hands-on personal involvement and will light up and be thrilled if an opportunity comes up for them to, it could be go on a vision trip, it could be to volunteer on a committee or come down to your facility and actually serve folks. Increasingly, this is something folks are looking for. When somebody has a combination of, I'm giving God's resources to this organization, and I am personally volunteering for or serving this organization in some way, any way, I am now connected and engaged at a heart level. I'm engaged at an entirely different level from the ministries that all I do is write checks. So to whatever extent you can, try to create volunteering and serving opportunities. It's a great way to connect with major donors who are retirees, who are maybe have gone through halftime, they've retired early, they've experienced success, and now they just want to pour back into the kingdom. Gen Xers and millennials, and empty nest stay-at-home moms. I was reminded recently, I was having this discussion with a group of ministry leaders, and one in the room had actually just become an empty nest stay-at-home mom. She was longing now to spend time pouring into ministries that she was giving to, even as she had spent so many years pouring into the kids when they were at home. But look for opportunities because a lot of your donor constituents will respond. And this is really important, reporting results based on the donor's values versus the standard cookie cutter approach. That's another way to engage donors at the heart level. When you're able to uncover from each donor, what is it about the ministry that they love? What's it about the ministry that caused them to give in the first place? What is it about the ministry and the work that's being done now that has caused them to continue to be an ongoing financial partner? What happens is most ministries develop one particular method of reporting their results, and that one method is used with all donors. I was with a ministry recently with all of the development professionals, and we did an exercise. What we said is, look back, let's break into small groups and just think through conversations you've personally had with major donors over the course of the past year. And as a group, let's try to come up with a handful of different reasons, because every donor is not giving to your organization for the exact same reason. This group came up with 16 different reasons to give that were verbalized by their major donors just in the last 12 months. Think about that. There, at least, if you divided up their major donor database, there were at least 16 different giving motivations. Well, what happens if the ministry is only communicating results, fruit, in one way? You're getting 1 out of every 16, but 15 out of 16 are not being engaged at the heart level. They may hear the results and be glad, but that's far different from really being engaged at a heart level. What happens when the major donor professional is able to uncover for every major donor, what is your primary giving motivation to this ministry? As soon as that is done, now all invitations to share in the work that God's doing, all reporting back of fruit, what God's doing in and through the ministry, can now be filtered through the lens of their primary giving motivation. I'm telling you, from the donor's perspective, that is an entirely different type of interaction. And when you're able to reach folks there, that is heart level engagement. Again, increasing giving and longevity of relationship, commitment to the ministry long term. So lack of clarity is a hindrance to major gifts. Lack of engagement is a significant hindrance to major gifts. Third, we touched on this earlier, but lack of relationship. When the ministry's development strategy has been emphasizing the transactional model versus the discipleship model, this is almost always the result. Sometimes ministry leaders and development professionals that use the transactional model, if you interact with that ministry leader, they'll say, oh no, we talk to every single major donor at least twice a year. We visit with them at least twice a year, and we have phone calls on the side. So in the ministry's eyes, we're building a great relationship, but they're not to the donor, because what's happening is, here's the ministry's needs and here's an ask. And then next time we get together, here are the ministry needs and here's an ask. That's not a relationship. They don't feel in any way attached relationally to the ministry. When the relational skills and a genuine caring personality, when that is conveyed by the ministry leaders in every interaction they have, that caring personality will always trump technical expertise, and vision and invitation will always trump impersonal ministry needs and a constant appeal for more money. So move as quickly as possible from the professional relationship to the personal relationship. But understand that major donors, remember, folks that give a lot of money away, they're not only getting constant bombardment from the ministries they currently are giving to, they are also being bombarded with appeals from ministries that they have never given money to that are trying to get them as a donor. It is nonstop. The ministry relationships that are going to survive are the ones where they have a personal connection, a personal relationship with somebody in the ministry. And the fourth hindrance to major gifts, this is significant, and it's something that you unfortunately have a bit less control over than I wish you did. The fourth hindrance to major gifts is lack of alignment. And when I refer to alignment, I'm not talking about alignment between the donor and you, your ministry. It's a lack of alignment between the donor's advisory team and their heart to give. For example, when their financial advisor or advisors, when their CPA and accountant, when their attorney or their estate planning attorney does not share the donor's biblical worldview and heart for generosity. This is the single biggest hindrance to radical generosity. And unfortunately, it has nothing to do with your mission, your vision, your results, or the excellence with which you've built a personal relationship. Because no matter what you do, someone else is ultimately going to be involved in the decision-making process. And if that person puts up a roadblock in the giving process, which frequently happens when there's not alignment, a gift that was contemplated simply will not be followed through because the advisory team advised against it. Let me share with you first off when this became true and why it's true, and then we'll talk about what you can do to uncover it and be aware of it when it exists. There's a study that for years actually had been done every other year by Bank of America in their wealth division in conjunction with the Center on Philanthropy at Indiana University. This study was of high net worth individuals' philanthropy. Every 2 years, they would do an in-depth study of very large givers, both faith-based and non-faith-based, looking for trends that were changing in philanthropy. And there was a difference from the 2006 study to the 2008 study that was so striking, the majority of their executive summary was devoted to this one point. And this, in my opinion, if I was a development professional, this is something that I would really want to and need to know. I'm reading to you now from the executive summary. One of the most striking differences between findings from the 2006 and 2008 studies is the dramatic increase in donors' use of legal and financial professionals to help them make charitable giving decisions. The 2006 study found that donors relied on nonprofit personnel, that's you all, relied on nonprofit personnel and their own peers more than any other source of advice in this area. The 2008 study finds accountants, attorneys, and financial advisors to be among the leading sources of charitable advice. End quote. What's interesting about this is when I read into the study, What I was curious about is, where did the ministry professionals end up? They weren't off of the list, but they were all the way down at the bottom. I think it was like 3% of these high net worth philanthropists said that they actually talked to people at the ministry about their charitable giving now. So within 2 years, you had this vast shift. This shift has actually caused a major change in our industry, financial services industry, because we're realizing, for the most part, this is tragic to me as an aside, but non-Christians tend to give away just as much money each year as a percentage of income as Christians do. I don't know how we're going to explain that to Jesus when we get there, but reality is non-Christians seem to be just as interested in philanthropy as Christians are. When you think about the percentage of giving, and if before, for decades, when your major donors wanted to talk about charitable giving strategy, they would look to you primarily. Then all of a sudden, even if they have the same relationship, the same great relationship with somebody at the ministry, they're now going immediately to their CPA and accountant. They're going to their attorney. They're going to their financial advisor. Some of them said they go to all three to process giving decisions before they make them. And that's certainly been our experience at Ron Blue, because we only give faith-based advice. We spend our time not helping folks kind of with the endless, mindless accumulation of wealth. We're helping folks set financial finish lines so that they can pour more resources into the kingdom. Most clients that we get to start working with came from another advisor, and the reason they came is because they got so tired of getting pushback from their advisory team every time they wanted to give more money away. But think about it logically. Let's just say what I do for a living is a financial advisor who gets paid to manage people's money. Doesn't it stand to reason that a secular financial advisor, when one of their clients shows up and says, hey, I just learned about this incredible strategy called giving appreciated assets, and I learned that if I give appreciated assets out of my investment portfolio, I can give a whole lot more money away because I never have to pay taxes to sell them to give the money away. What is the advisor who is being paid on those assets likely to respond with? I mean, if you think about how this works, you need to be asking yourself, for every major donor God has given us, who are their key advisors? Because if they're a person of means, of wealth, virtually every wealthy Christian has at least one, and sometimes multiple, financial advisors. They've got at least one CPA accounting firm. They've got at least one attorney. In many cases, they've got a family attorney and an estate planning attorney, and they may have a trust officer. And one of those folks probably carries more weight than the others, but that's who they're going to go get advice from when they have an idea for giving more money away. So ask yourself the question, who are their key advisors, and to what extent are they encouraging and supporting or working against your efforts to encourage greater generosity? Imagine the donor goes to, I was just at one of these, donor goes to a ministry event, and one of the key points that was discussed was tax efficiency and giving strategy. It was incredible discussion triggered by a group of major donors who were hearing for the first time how tax efficient it is to do their giving out of their net worth instead of just giving from income. But I can tell you what was going to happen, because I've had enough folks report this back to me over the years. They're going to go back and sit down with their financial advisor who they're paying to manage the wealth, and they're going to be talked out of it. I actually had one poor widow, incredibly generous. She was so excited when she learned about portfolio giving. She actually left her meeting with her secular financial advisor in tears, because she was made to feel stupid. She was made to feel like, I don't know what you heard them say at that Christian event, but I'm telling you, that's a really poor decision to make. It's not best for you financially long-term. This kind of stuff is really, really scary, and it should be, but it is out there. And to the extent that your donors have an advisory team that is not aligned with their biblical worldview and their heart from generosity, you need to understand that there might be somebody on the other side that, as much as you're pouring in and discipling and stirring their heart by encouraging them with regard to the mission and the vision and to increasing generosity. I mean, imagine, this was another recent event, a major donor event that talked about legacy giving. Some of the major donors in the room were all excited. They had never heard about it before. They had never contemplated the idea of leaving money to the kingdom out of their estate when they die. And I could tell you most Christians who hear about this idea and are encouraged, they get really excited about, at the very least, tithing their estate, but leaving some significant part of their estate to the kingdom. But what happens when that donor goes back to their estate attorney to get their documents redone so they can leave a portion of their estate to your ministry, and the estate attorney who doesn't share their biblical worldview or heart from generosity talks them out of it? This to me is keeping so many resources from the kingdom. And the reason is they are paying these folks as professionals and been trusting them for years to give them counsel. And at some point they start to ask themselves, this is a trusted advisor. They're not going to lead me astray. They're going to tell me in their professional opinion what's the best thing to do. The unfortunate reality is wealthy Christians, I've been hearing this for years and years, wealthy Christians often lament their advisory team always pushing back on their level of giving and their desire to be more generous. I've even tragically heard back from donors who hired a Christian advisor or Christian CPA or attorney specifically for this reason because they expected there to be alignment, but that advisor works for a secular organization and they are likewise discouraging the radical generosity. This to me, friends, you can do your part perfectly. You can embrace the discipleship model. You can build these long-term, enduring relationships, pouring spiritually into the families that God has entrusted to you, encouraging them in their generosity, continually keeping the vision in front of them and reporting the fruit and what God's doing. And they will remain engaged with your ministry at the heart level, but their giving will not increase despite your best efforts if they've surrounded themselves with an advisory team that stands diametrically opposed to everything that you're doing, pouring into them. So it is vitally important to know who is influencing your major donors' giving decisions. So a natural question that you might ask is, well, Jim, it makes logical sense to me. I would love to learn this, but how do I do it? Because some of my relationships I've had for a really long time, and I've never talked to them about this kind of stuff. Let me give you 3 diagnostic questions, just sample questions that you can tailor to your own personality that you can ask the next time you're face-to-face with a donor to determine whether or not this is a problem, a hindrance in their generosity. Let me just give you the 3 questions, and you don't need to remember all 3. Pick one. Just pick one that you're comfortable asking. None of these are threatening in any way to the donor, and see if that doesn't open the door to a pretty significant discussion, and in many cases, frustration being voiced by your donor. Question 1, does your financial advisory team share your biblical worldview? Easy question to ask. Second question, have you ever gotten pushback on your charitable giving from any of your financial advisors? And a third possibility, who do you typically consult when you have questions about charitable giving strategies? One thing I want to encourage you, especially if you're contemplating asking this type of diagnostic question to somebody that you've been walking with for a long time and have never had the discussion, if you want to ask it, but it feels a little bit awkward or uncomfortable just because you've never talked to them about it before, then use this excuse. I was just in a meeting with a bunch of ministry leaders and somebody who does philanthropic counsel for years and years, and they were sharing with us that a lot of their Christians that they work with have non-Christian advisors who are talking them out of generosity. I was just curious, does your financial advisory team share your biblical worldview? In other words, frame it as, I was just introduced to this concept. I never thought about it before. Have you ever gotten pushback on your charitable giving decisions from any of your financial advisors? Needless to say, advisory team misalignment is one of the most significant hindrances to major donors maximizing their generosity. If you run into this particular issue as you engage your major donors in discussion about the counsel they're receiving from their advisory team, contact whoever it is at Ron Blue who invited you to this webinar. Whatever contact you have at Ron Blue, they may be able to help equip you either with resources or talking points that'll help you overcome this issue or go deeper with your donor, hopefully to be able to stimulate your donor's interest in being more generous despite the advice they're getting to the contrary. We're happy to help you all in any way that we can. So thanks for giving up a portion of your morning to participate in this webinar. I sincerely hope that some of the ideas presented will be not only helpful in some way, but also immediately actionable. Thanks so much for the work that you're doing to advance God's priorities in the world. Never forget that the work you do has eternal significance. May God richly bless you in this work. Thank you.